Well, hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. Yay to you. So, as he said, I'm Eric Lander. I'm President Biden's science advisor and the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. So, science and technology are obviously at the core of solving so many of the world's pressing challenges. We've seen it play out in many, many ways. And early in my career, I was involved in the Human Genome Project, when the world came together to take on a task that people thought might take 200 years to read out the human genetic information. And by working together and through innovation, it got done in 13 years. More recently, we've seen it play out with the pandemic, where investments that were made over the course of 20 years in basic science and in applied research enabled rapid development of safe and effective COVID vaccines during the midst of a global pandemic. But of course, to get the job done, governments have to play crucial roles, using buying power to reduce risks, providing incentives to private industry, deploying many millions of vaccine doses, and there's still lots more we need to do. We've got to do the same thing in driving a transition to a clean and equitable energy system, where science and technology are essential to achieving President Biden's commitment to a net zero emissions economy no later than 2050. Now, so far at COP26, we've heard about historic investments, actions, and commitments by many countries, including commitments by the United States to address the climate crisis, reducing emissions by 50 to 52% by 2030, cutting methane emissions by 30%, and getting us and keeping us on track to reach net zero by 2050. These collectively represent a massive increase in U.S. ambition and a powerful statement about the commitment of U.S. leadership. Achieving net zero emissions is going to require a lot. It's going to achieving a transformation in our global energy system. It's going to require removing substantial quantities of CO2 from the atmosphere, controlling emissions of non-CO2 greenhouse gases, and it's going to require, if we're going to hold ourselves to it, comprehensive measurement and monitoring of greenhouse gas emissions and removals. So today, at this panel, and we have an amazing panel here today, we are focused on the energy transition. We need, to be sure, massive scale deployment of clean energy technologies, many of which exist today and can be pulled into the market. The sheer scale of the deployment that is needed really causes us to shift what we previously thought would be possible. Global solar and wind capacity additions are likely going to need to scale up by 1,000 gigawatts per year. That's roughly equal to the entire energy generating capacity of the United States every year. Global electric vehicle charging stations need to surge from about 1 million that have been accumulated over the last decade to 40 million that will need to be accumulated over the next decade. But in addition to this deployment, we need massive innovation. Some of the technologies we'll want to get us all the way to net zero are in various stages of development. Now, we know that innovation can produce remarkable results. In our country, beginning in the 1970s in response to the energy crisis, we created a whole Department of Energy. And over the course of decades, it and others made investments in solar and wind and other clean energy solutions. And these investments gave rise to technologies and breakthroughs that today enable solar power to be as cheap or cheaper than electricity from fossil fuels. And wind energy and batteries are following very close behind. In 1975, solar energy existed, but it was 100-fold more expensive than fossil fuels. By a decade ago, it was down to 10-fold more expensive, but still 10-fold. Over this past decade, it has fallen to be on par or below. Well, even as we invest in deploying the fruits of past investments in solar, wind, batteries as far and as fast as we can, we've also got to continue investing in even more science and technology because we're not done with the breakthroughs that are still possible and that we're going to want and that we're going to need. For example, if we can get clean electricity cheap enough and reliable enough, we can use it to make green steel that is the cheapest steel and clean fuels that are the cheapest fuels. We want innovation in everything, from pushing big advances in solutions that are already here today, for example, solar and wind, to enabling those that are not quite here but within reach, for example, hydrogen made from renewable electricity, and to seeing if we can accelerate things that are now over the horizon, even things like fusion and everything in between on that spectrum. As scientists and technologists, our collective job is to make sure that there is a full menu of options that the world can choose from to get to net zero. Because different countries will need and want different choices. But eventually, we need to make sure that the cleanest choice is always the cheapest choice, so that it's the easy choice for everyone. So every country can have more energy, not less, to drive prosperity without wrecking the planet. We can do this, but it won't be easy, and it will take a world working together. And as countries, we need to work together to develop national innovation pathways, also called S&T roadmaps for the energy transition, that chart out this virtuous cycle of imagine, invent, deploy, imagine, invent, deploy, that drives so much progress so that we can deliver the solutions we want and we need. So on this panel, we're going to discuss how science and technology can help develop, deliver, and deploy zero-carbon energy and infrastructure that can address the energy needs of all countries and turn our climate ambitions, stated so clearly here by our country and so many other countries, into reality. We have a great panel, and I am so grateful that everybody agreed to participate in this. Let me introduce them now, and then I'll turn to them for comments. We have, and I'm going from closest to me to furthest, Ambassador Mary Warlick. She is the Deputy Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. She retired from a 34-year career in the State Department, during which she served most recently as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary and Acting Special Envoy and Coordinator for International Energy Affairs. Before that, she was Ambassador to Serbia under President Obama, Consul General in Melbourne, Australia, and Counselor for Economic Affairs in Moscow. It's great to have Ambassador Warlick here. Next up, we have Acting Assistant Secretary Kelly Speaks-Backman of the Department of Energy. She is also the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, EERE, as it's abbreviated amongst everybody I know, at the Department of Energy. And she is focused on creating and sustaining American leadership in the transition to a clean energy economy. She oversees the planning and execution of the organization's nearly $3 billion portfolio of research, development, demonstration, and deployment activities in energy efficiency, renewable energy, and sustainable transformation. And thank you for being here. Next up, we have Dr. Nebojša Nakicenovic, who everybody calls Naki, and I will fall into calling Naki also, but he is officially Nebojša Nakicenovic. And he is the deputy chair of the group of chief science advisors, the 7 chief scientific advisors to the European Commission. And he is also the director of the World in 2050, which is a project, not a job description. He might end up being the director of the World in 2050, we'll see. But at the moment, he's the director of a project called the World in 2050. He's former deputy director general and acting director general of the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Next, we have Varun Sivaram. Varun is is senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate John Kerry. where he leads work on clean energy innovation and competitiveness. He has very serious technical chops as a scientist, but where in fact he previously served as the Chief Technology Officer of Renew Power, where he led research and development for a multi-billion-dollar company recognized as India's largest producer of renewable energy. So he brings experience from government and industry and a wonderful international perspective. Finally, we have Dr. Mona Niemer here. She is Canada's Chief Science Advisor, and her role is to provide science advice to the Prime Minister of Canada and the Cabinet. She's an internationally renowned cardiovascular scientist and geneticist and a distinguished academic leader. I know of her work from my own work in biology. Dr. Niemer has made seminal contributions to several fields ranging from gene regulation to molecular cardiology. It's a really good panel. So I am now going to turn, starting with Ambassador Warlick from the International Energy Agency. Ambassador Warlick, the IEA has outlined a highly ambitious set of pathways to net zero emissions by 2050. Here's a small question. What are the elements that we need in this plan? What technologies are ready to go? What technologies need more work? And what kind of scale of investment in R&D are we talking about? Double, triple where we are today? Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Lander. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm really honored to have the opportunity to be here with my distinguished colleagues and to talk a little bit about the IEA's Net Zero Roadmap to 2050. In just a few short minutes, I'd start by saying, you know, this report, and I really encourage all of you to read it in more detail, lays out and really explores the question of the transition. How do we get to a net zero energy system by 2050? And at the same time ensure stable, affordable energy supplies and provide energy access and ensure we maintain robust economic growth. So these are all really important objectives as we look at the pathways forward. The roadmap, you know, sets out more than 400 milestones to guide the global journey to net zero by 2050. And we certainly acknowledge, as you've mentioned, that countries will have different starting points and countries will have various mixes of energy sources that they're looking at as they begin that journey. But taking a look more globally at how we get there, we did identify a few important targets. Including, and I know this has been quite widely reported, no new investment in new fossil fuel supply projects, no further final investment decisions on new unabated coal plants, and I know that's been something under discussion quite a bit here in Glasgow. By 2035, no new sales of internal combustion engine passenger cars. And by 2040, the global electricity sector has already reached net zero emissions. So important targets, and those are some of the goals outlined. In the near term, the net zero pathway really requires, and this is important, immediate, massive, continued deployment of all clean and efficient energy technologies, combined with a big, major global push to accelerate innovation. As you've said yourself, there's a great importance to really accelerate our focus on innovation. Most of the global reductions in CO2 emissions between now and 2030 in the net zero pathway that we outline come from technologies that are already available. So getting to 2030 will still require not just ambition and real commitment to implementation, but to get to 2050 and the net zero goal there is going to require additional significant investments in new technology and innovation. A lot of these technologies are currently at the demonstration phase, not yet commercially available, and international collaboration on developing those technologies is going to be so important. A few key areas that we believe really need to be focused on are advanced batteries, right, to unlock the electrification of heavy-duty trucks, for example, ships, even short flights. Carbon removal technologies, which have been much discussed, such as direct air capture, bioenergy with CCS. CCUS will need as well further development. And third, scaling up electrolyzers for hydrogen production. Again, much discussed, but to get there and to rely on hydrogen the way that we're hoping to will require additional, not only additional investments, but development of further technology. So those are just a few of the highlights that I'd mentioned for now.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much. And if we're talking about investments, we have the right person coming up next. We have Acting Assistant Secretary Speaks Backman from the Department of Energy. And so my question for you is, the Department of Energy is ramping up investments in technologies that we need to get to net zero by 2050. And you and your colleagues have announced several Earthshots, I love the name, to transform key technologies within this decade. So what do you mean by an Earthshot? And what's different about this than the way we normally do R&D? And maybe in your answer you could also say, take the example of the long duration storage Earthshot. So tell us what DOE is up to.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for inviting me to join such a distinguished panel. This is exciting, and I appreciate your remarks about the continuum from early research to applied research through demonstration and deployment. It's an important continuum that we are paying especially attention to as this climate crisis is becoming more and more intense. And we really, at DOE, while we do, our bread and butter is on the research, we really need to make sure that we're working on that continuum into demonstration and deployment. The Earthshots, a little bit of a continuum here. I'll start with 1961, when President Kennedy first announced the moonshot, where in 10 years he said he was going to get the United States to the moon, and he did that in less than 10 years. Fast forward to 2011, and the Department of Energy announced a sunshot, where we would reduce the cost of solar by 75% in the next decade. And we did that by 2017, so a little bit faster. And now fast forward 10 years later to 2021, where we have announced 3 Earthshots, really based on the reaction to the immediate need, not only for deployment of those technologies that are ready to deploy, ready to go out into the market, ready to be adopted by industry, and businesses, but what is the next era? And then what is the era after that? So we introduced 3 Earthshots, the first being a hydrogen Earthshot, the second being a long duration energy storage Earthshot, and the third, just last week, announced by the Secretary, the carbon negative Earthshot. You asked specifically about the long duration Earthshot. That's a pretty exciting one and near and dear to my heart. That Earthshot is set up to reduce the cost of long duration storage, and by that I define that as 10 hours or more, by 90% within the next decade. That's across all technologies, so it's not just different battery technologies, but also mechanical, thermal, and others. So on average, a 90% reduction. We think that that's going to help us in getting to that carbon neutral, or I should say completely greenhouse gas carbon-free grid by 2035, which the president has laid out for us. And right now, the 4-hour batteries that are on the grid today are sufficient for the amount of renewable energy that we have on the grid. But if we're going to get to those levels of 80 and 90 and 100% clean energy that are made with variable resources such as solar and wind, we have to think through longer duration storage. And so that's in a nutshell what that is.
That's pretty exciting, and so I also love the way this is reduced by tenfold the cost of 10 hours storage in 10 years. So it's very easy to remember, and I kind of like. Right, exactly, exactly. So let's go to Naki from the European Commission, one of the science advisors. And you have thought a lot and written a lot about the clean energy transitions in your career. And I've read many of the things you have written. So recently, with a group of chief science advisors to the European Commission, you published a scientific opinion that outlines how Europe could become a carbon neutral continent. And in one of the papers, I think in 2017, you talked about how the 2020s are the time for Herculean efforts, and the 2030s need to be the time for many breakthroughs. So what do you mean by the Herculean effort decade and the many breakthroughs decade? And how do we make sure we're working on the right problems with the right people, with the right amount of resources in the right places to make sure the investments in science deliver on the scale we need, which is reductions of gigatons?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to this great panel. And I have to say, the question is really a tough one. So let me just try to respond to it. First of all, I think energy services are absolute key for human prosperity and for making peace with nature. And without solving the energy equation, we will not be there. And in our scientific opinion that you mentioned for the European Commission, that's based on the evidence report of the European Academies of Sciences, we argue for a people-centered approach to achieve this, and that's why I call it Herculean effort. Now, this is very much rooted and consistent with the European Green Deal, which I would characterize very briefly as an action agenda to achieve sustainable development goals, including the climate. And in last June, Europe adopted a new legislature that's called Fit for 55. And what it really means is by 2030, 9 years from now, reduce the emissions by 55% and be carbon neutral or greenhouse gas neutral by 2050. And I think that's why what you mentioned, Europe could become the first carbon-free continent that way. Now, I call this personally the carbon law. There are three components to that, and this is why heroic efforts are required. Number one component is to go down from 40 gigatons of greenhouse gas emissions today down to 20 in about a decade. So it's similar to your rule, in 10 years, half, all the way down to close to zero. So that's number one challenge. Number two challenge is we will not be exactly at zero. That's very unlikely. That means we need to enhance the sinks. And one of the big dangers, I think, that we have today is by changing the Earth systems, we are also endangering Mother Earth's sinks. And without them, we will not be carbon neutral. And the third component that is really essential, and you talked about that, is carbon removal. And I personally prefer nature-based approaches like afforestation, sustainable agriculture, but we'll probably need also carbon capture and storage, and that's where we are at research and development and deployment. We have to deploy these technologies. So my second answer to your question is this ramping down, halving emissions every decade, is probably not going to be linear. We know that from history of technology. We'll have to start on a deep ascent, going from increasing emissions down to falling emissions. But I would say the second decade is going to be really transformational, really new technologies that you talked about. So from 2030 to 2040, we will probably have to go very steep down and then flatten out a bit, because that's going to be very heavy lifting. You mentioned steel made with hydrogen, concrete with no emissions, you name it. I mean, these are technologies that are not commercial today, and I fully agree. I think that was the second part of your question. How can this be resilient? Because none of us can really guess what's going to work. So we need a plan. That is what I would like to argue for. We need a plan. The plan should be flexible. It should allow dropping things that don't work, but massively supporting what works, and in particular in the deployment area. And you said, I think, what you mentioned going from R&D and basic research down to deployment and then diffusion, pervasive adoption. I would argue that's an interactive process because it's about learning. If we don't do it, we forget. So we have to do it to learn and to overcome the uncertainty and the resilience of different solutions in different parts of the world. So that would be my take on this challenge, and that's why I think metaphor of Herculean efforts is not completely inappropriate. And putting people at the center also means that it has to be our own agenda. I think governments are there to catalyze that, private sector to invest in the right things, but we need to make choices.
We do need to make choices, and especially we need to have plans. So our next speaker, Dr. Varun Sivaram, is the scientist and diplomat, which is a rare combination in the world. And my question for Varun is, you know, the U.S. is part of several pretty exciting international efforts to advance clean energy, including the First Movers Coalition and Mission Innovation. And I was hoping you could talk about the connection among international efforts like these and technology deployment and innovation, and how we can, you know, what these are and how we can leverage these connections for a rapid clean energy transition. And maybe given your global perspective of having worked in the United States and in India, to also talk about the actions needed for the whole world to do this.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lander. Terrific to be here. Fantastic panel. Look, your question is perfect. Here we are at COP. We're talking about international climate action, and we're at the U.S. Pavilion. So what's the most useful thing the United States can do to speed international climate action? In a word, it is innovation. As we raise our innovation ambition, we can raise the world's climate ambition. Because by reducing the cost of technologies and bringing to market new technologies, we make it easier for every country around the world to decarbonize. I'll be blunt. The most useful high leverage dollar the United States can spend is on driving down the cost of these technologies. So that's at a high level kind of the thesis for how the United States can be extraordinarily effective in our international climate action. And there are kind of three ways you can think about U.S. action. The first is getting governments together to collaborate on clean energy innovation. So you mentioned, Dr. Lander, you mentioned mission innovation. Under the Obama-Biden administration in 2015, we spearheaded the launch of this new international organization to bring together countries to make commitments on investing in research and development and demonstration, as Kelly was talking about. And now we've rebooted Mission Innovation 2.0, under which we have these technology missions. The U.S., through the Department of Energy's leadership, is leading on a shipping mission with Denmark. In hydrogen, they just launched a new carbon-negative Earthshot, but also a carbon-negative mission for Mission Innovation. The idea is just as what Kelly said, is we're organizing our research and development along technology goals, like reducing the cost of hydrogen. Similarly, in the international context, we're organizing governments to pick a mission and reduce the cost of those technologies across borders, because innovation nowadays is inherently a global enterprise. And there are many pre-competitive things we can do together. For example, collaborating on technical standards, which are super important to bring down the cost of clean technologies. The second sort of thing that we can all come together and do, and that the United States can lead on, is engaging the private sector. So, Dr. Lander, you mentioned the First Movers Coalition. President Biden announced the First Movers Coalition. In fact, he was so interested, he looked all the way through the deck at all the analytical details of the First Movers Coalition, along with Secretary Kerry, which brought together 34 of the world's biggest companies, more than $8 trillion in market value, to make purchasing commitments this decade, by 2030, to bring to market technologies that aren't commercially viable today. You know, as we heard from Ambassador Warlick, 50% of the emissions reductions we need by 2050 to get to net zero have to come from technologies that aren't yet on the market. They're not ready for market. And in order to get those technologies on the market, these major companies, Amazon, Apple, Boeing, United Airlines, Delta, Salesforce, are all going to send demand signals. Volvo, for example, committed to buy 10% of its steel in 2030 from near zero carbon sources. We have enough near zero carbon steel today to make some candle holders. But by 2030, we're going to build several full-scale plants to meet the demand from these first mover companies. In aviation, companies like United Airlines or Apple are going to replace 5% of their conventional jet fuel demand with the most advanced technologies that can reduce emissions by 85% or more. We're not just talking about the first generation of biofuels. We're talking about synthetic fuels, where you take clean energy, produce hydrogen, use captured carbon dioxide, and produce a jet fuel that's actually quite clean. And this goes on. In shipping, Amazon is one of our first movers, in trucking, etc. And then the third point to make is, although there are many ways that governments can come together and collaborate on innovation, inherently this is also a competitive enterprise. And it will be critical for the United States as we make our investments in the next generation of technologies. It'll be critical for us to build industries that are globally competitive. We go around the world right now and we encourage countries to reduce their emissions. It should be the case that when a Vietnam or an India reduces its emissions, it's American companies that benefit, along with the global value chains that American companies anchor. Look, a rising tide will lift all boats. And by 2030, we could have $4 trillion. Again, I'm quoting you, Dr. Warlick. We could have $4 trillion in 2030 in clean energy investments in a net zero aligned future. That means that if the United States seizes shares of these growing multi-trillion-dollar markets, and we have supply chains with the allies and like-minded partners around the world that we trust, there's going to be a lot of benefit to share. That's why the United States is working on a national clean tech competitiveness strategy, and we've invited public comments. We have a request for comments that we've publicly put out through the Department of Commerce. So let me pause there, but that's how innovation links to our international climate action strategy.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much. And our last panelist is my fellow science advisor, Dr. Mona Niemer. So, Dr. Niemer, what are the mechanisms of cooperation that national science advisors like yourself can leverage to enable a clean energy transmission? And how do government investments in science infrastructure enable net zero emissions? And you and I, together with many other science advisors, just co-authored a statement that was released yesterday calling for bold climate action, as well as for countries to each develop ambitious scientific evidence-based long-term strategies. So what should we be doing in these scientific roadmaps to give the public confidence that together we are going to meet these important climate targets?
Well, thank you very much, and I'm delighted to join our best neighbors here on the panel and hearing about all the innovation and the great work that DOE has done over the years. It's just like fantastic. I think that science advisors have a very important role to play in the coming years as conveners, as facilitators, bringing best practices, international know-how, and adapting it, of course, to the local, to the context of their respective countries, and doing a little bit of an innovation diplomacy, maybe, to turn more scientists into diplomats, perhaps. But and again, it's been mentioned, right now we have 2/3 of the technology needed to reach our ambitions for 2030, and less than 1/3 of those needed for 2050. So I think, providing science advice, evidence-based, knowledge that can guide policy, that can guide priorities, that can guide these roadmaps, because they need to be both ambitious, practical, and realistic at the same time. So I think it's really important, and it's important that we have, monitoring as well of our progress, because this is what's going to instill public trust and motivate people to continue the journey together. And in this, I think that we have a lot of learnings from this pandemic that, thanks to science and innovation, actually we're still around and we can all meet again in person. So I think that we're going to be very busy and it's going to be a collective effort, on everyone. But another area perhaps is, I think that the public is thirsty for evidence and for science. and scientists are still, credible and well regarded. And I think that science advisors need to embrace science communication as well to increase public trust in, all this uncertainty and unknown.
Well, thank you for all that you are doing, Mona. It's really great, and it's great to get to work with you. We have a few minutes. We'll need to stop around 3:50, I'm told, but we got about 12 minutes or so, and so I might toss some questions out to the panel, and we don't have to go down and have each person give an answer, so jump in if you would like to answer. And let me start with a pretty clear fact that to get to net zero, we are going to need a lot of electrification. A lot. So that requires massive shifts in the way that we use energy. Electrifying our vehicles, our homes, our businesses, an awful lot of industry, almost everything else. So what innovations are coming soon or on the horizon or needed that's going to enable rapid conversion to electrification in so many systems, including just beyond generating the electricity, because the electricity still's got to get to my house and my business and my car and everything like that. Would someone like to solve this for us? Naki, go for it.
Not solve it, but just comment.
Oh, okay.
So electrification, I think, is the key, and we have heard from the other colleagues on the panel, also hydrogen in the long run. These are the two energy carriers that are zero emissions. Now, I would argue that, we heard a lot about what technologies are required. To have pervasive electrification, I think a systemic perspective is a must, because many technologies and behaviors have to fit together to make the system work. And to answer your question, at least partially, my feeling is that it's the digital revolution that will allow that. That will allow decentralized and centralized systems to be harmonized. That will allow harmonization in time through storage and other means. So digital technologies, from AI to artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on, I think could become the catalyst. I think that's the next revolution. And just to give an example why I think this could be powerful, if you think about the mobile phone, everybody has one in the world. And it's more efficient than everything it has replaced. So, and it took 30 years, and we have 30 years. So one can be optimistic, I think, if we invest in science, technology, and deployment.
Kelly, do you want to jump in?
I would, thank you. I want to appreciate your approach in a systematic way, and I would say one of the one of the innovations that's necessary is understanding how to integrate all of these technologies. I think that's an important element that we can't forget. At our National Renewable Energy Laboratory, we have a system called ARES, which stands for Advanced Research in Integrated Energy Systems, and it's about a 2 megawatt platform in which you can demonstrate how millions and millions of appliances can be interconnected with buildings that have transportation, which have buildings be prosumers and instead of just consumers. And really that interaction and that integration is how we're going to get the next level of efficiency out of our systems so that we don't have to overinvest. And I think that's an important element that we need to think about.
That's fantastic. So I'm told that we're going to have to end 5 minutes earlier than advertised because, well, the energy transition has to keep moving rapidly. So let me just thank the panel and say, just seeing this fantastic group and hearing this discussion, it is clear we need massive deployment. I'm so thrilled to hear the commitment to massive innovation to match massive deployment. I am excited that in so many conversations around this COP, I hear countries very interested in working together on detailed science and technology roadmaps for the energy transition, national innovation pathways that will get us there, that will involve really detailed sectoral energy transition roadmaps like you've heard from the panelists, analyses of the gaps that we have to fill. There is no choice, and it will bring clarity to know where we have to put those investment dollars. And the United States has a special responsibility and obligation to be investing in those things. And also metrics that will keep us on track. leading indicators, not lagging indicators, of how we are getting to 2050. So I am very hopeful. I am a hopeful person. I am optimistic that with science and technology and international cooperation, we will get there. I am also a realist, and I know that we will only get there if we work very, very hard, and if we fulfill our obligations, all of us, that we have to the whole world. So thank you. Please join me in thanking this amazing panel and for being here.